Hey, how you doing? Justin here. Today we're going to be talking a bit about jazz lingo, or some of the slang words that are used in jazz that you might not be too familiar with. You know, I had a funny experience when I was getting into jazz of just really getting a bit baffled by all of these words that everyone was using. I was just a kid and playing in a band full of older people, and they're all using this language that seemed really foreign. So luckily one of the guys sat down with me and explained what everything meant, and I thought I'd pass that along to you and help you out with some of the terms that you might not be familiar with. It'll make your jazz journey a little bit more comfortable. So first word, standard, playing a standard. So a standard is just a song. It's a song that people use as a vehicle for improvising normally. So they're normally got a melody, well, normally got a melody. They've definitely got a melody and chords. Sometimes they've got a lyric. If they've got a lyric, you definitely should learn the words to the song. I think that's a really good idea, but we'll talk about a bit more about that later. Many of them are show tunes from the 30s, 40s and 50s, that kind of era. But modern songs became kind of standard as well, or more modern songs from the 50s and 60s by Miles Davis or whatever. Even later on, some of the bands like the Yellow Jackets, Sonny Rollins was producing stuff right later on. So some of those songs became standards, but really the standards are the kind of the songs that you find in that book called The Real Book, which I mentioned a lesson ago. All of those songs would be considered jazz standards, and if you want to get into playing jazz, there's a certain kind of body of those jazz standards that you should definitely know. So Autumn Leaves and All of the Things You Are, and Blue Bossa, and Body and Soul, and Misty, and whatever. There's many of them that are kind of the standard repertoire for a jazz musician. So it would be expected if you went to a jazz jam night that you would know at least some of those standards. Okay, so that's what a standard tune is. The Real Book I mentioned last lesson, so that's just a book, a collection of standards, usually with the melody and the chords and sometimes the words written out. So you should definitely have a real book or a fake book. You know, I don't think you should use it forever, and if you ever get to the point where you consider yourself a jazz musician, you should be able to do gigs without having to have the real book in front of you. You know, you should have the songs in here. A chart. So a chart is what you would see the standard written on. It would be normally written in regular notation. You're not likely to find tab in a jazz chart. In fact, I've never seen tab in a jazz chart. You might be able to buy books of tab stuff, but really if you're going to get into the jazz thing, you need to get a bit of a theory knowledge and stuff, and you probably want to start learning to read music, at least so you can read the melody. So a chart will give you the chords and the melody, and usually the form of the song. So we're going to talk about sections in a second, but a very common thing is that you have what's called the A section, and there's a repeat, so you play the A section again, then you have a B section, and then you might go back to play the A section again as the form of the song, A, B, A. So sometimes you just have A, B, sometimes you have A, B, A, C, but the chart will help you get the form, and trying to memorize the chart is a good idea because it'll help you remember the chords and the melody and the structure of the tune, you know. So I always try and make like a mental picture of the chart as well. I think that's a good idea. Okay, the head. Often people talk about the head. Play the head again. Huh? So the head is the melody, okay? Head often meaning the start of a tune. So, you know, at the head of the tune would meaning at the start. But when people talk about the head, it's normally referring to the melody of the song. That's one that I found a little bit weird when we first got into the jazz thing. So it's just the melody. So, you know, I'll play the head, then Fred takes a solo, then James takes a solo, then we'll play the head again. That's the kind of conversation that you might hear, right? So they're going to play the melody of the song, a couple of rounds of solos, and then we'll play the head to go out again. Also, actually, we should talk about choruses as well. So a chorus in a pop song, you have like verses and choruses and pre-choruses and bridges, but in jazz you tend to call a chorus as like the whole structure of the song. So if it's A, B, A structure of the song, like the whole chart all of the way through, you would refer to that as a chorus. So you might say, let's play the head, and then there'll be, James can take a solo for 2 choruses. So that means that he would improvise around the song twice the way through the whole chart. Okay, that would be what's referred to as a chorus. Okay, it's not actually to do with like verse, chorus, bridge, that sort of stuff. It's just the chorus is the whole arrangement when you're talking about jazz improvising. changes. Okay, so when you hear people talking about changes in jazz, we're talking about chord changes or key changes. Okay, so it could be either one. More often than not, it's referring to key changes. But when you're saying, like, that's a nice set of changes to play over, you're saying that's a nice set of chords to improvise with, you know. So it's a very common term, you know, say Giant Steps has got really difficult changes to play over, meaning that the chord progression and the way that the chords move in and change key is difficult to solo over in Giant Steps, which is very true. It's a bit of a bugger, that tune. Kind of fun if you do it real slow but hard at tempo. Anyway, so that's changes. Rhythm changes, however, interesting term, rhythm changes, is actually nothing to do with rhythm or rhythm guitar. It's from a song called I Got Rhythm by George Gershwin, and it's got a very, very common chord sequence which lots of people wrote different heads on. Okay, so that one set of changes, the one chord progression, has lots of different heads, lots of different melodies. So I Got Rhythm is the kind of the founding one, but you got stuff even like the Flintstones theme is I Got Rhythm Changes, or simplified to the rhythm changes. So if you listen to the Flintstones theme, you'll hear that's the jazz sequence called I Got Rhythm. But there were many other heads. Old Leo's another really common kind of beboppy one. It's a really interesting sequence to play over. It's got quite a lot of key changes, and there's lots of different kind of ways of treating it harmonically. So it's a very common with jazz musicians because of how many different ways you can play with it. You know, that's how that one goes. So the different sections. There's quite a lot of these, isn't there? When we talk about the different sections, you often see like an A and a B section. So I mentioned before, like an A section might be a particular melody, which is then repeated. So you'd say the structure was going A, if the first melody was repeated, and then there'd be a new part of music, new piece, which would be the B section, very often called the bridge, but it's not necessarily B for bridge, it's just the B section. And it's often called the bridge, and you would have then an A section again. But if you had the first melody, second melody, first melody again, and then another new melody, the form would be A, B, A, C. Okay? It's really a useful thing to know about when you're playing a tune, what the form is, what the structure of the song is. Can help you remember the change, help you remember the chord changes, help you remember the melody, help you remember where you are when you're improvising. Very, very useful thing, and often used for rehearsals too, or explaining. Like I might say, hey, you know, let's go and check out that B section again because the changes are a little bit tricky, that kind of thing. So making sure you're aware of your section markers, that would be their proper term there. I just mentioned the bridge. So the bridge is normally that the thing that's a little bit different. So normally you have like a melody that's uses the same chord sequence, usually a very similar melody, and then you have another a different melody. In a pop song it would be the same as a chorus, but in jazz they often term it as being the bridge because the chorus is the structure of the whole song. So that's most of the structures. All of these are written down on the website in case you forget what I'm talking about. You don't have to take notes or anything. Okay, on to a little bit about the actual improvising part. To blow is to improvise. I'm guessing it comes from sax players and trumpet players that have to blow through their instrument, but that would be it's the most common term that I heard for improvising would be, do you fancy blowing over these changes? You know, that would be the term. Like, would you like to improvise over this set of chord changes? That would be the term, you know. So blowing it, you know, that cat's blowing some awesome stuff at that, you know, that kind of vernacular is what's used. So blowing, improvising, that's the term. You don't really use it in blues. You don't hear, you know, Eric Clapton blew a great solo over that. Sounds funny, but in jazz, blowing refers to guitar and piano, instruments that don't have to blow. And they blow lines. Here we go. So in rock and pop, you tend to have licks. So you have short little phrases, which are part of the vocabulary of the music. In jazz, you have what they call lines, which they are essentially the same as licks, but usually they're a bit longer. So in a blues form, you might have a really short little lick, you know, and then you join together lots of these little licks. Whereas in jazz, because you're navigating your way through chord changes and key changes, you tend to have lines that kind of flow through those changes changes. You don't have a line for each chord. You'll have a line that goes over a particular set of chord sequences, particularly things like 2-5-1s, which is a very common jazz chord sequence. So you'd learn 2-5-1 lines. You could call them 2-5-1 licks too if you want, but more commonly they're called lines. So lines are just licks. You often hear jazz people talking about chops. You get it in other techniques too, but particularly in jazz, you hear people talking about somebody's chops. Chops is just your technique. If you've got great chops, you've got really good technique, and you can play fast, you can play difficult stuff. You know, I don't think chops are the most important thing. I think having great ear and a great sense of melody is the most important thing, but definitely having some chops is a good idea as well. Outside, that was another term that used to baffle me. When people talk about playing outside, they're talking about playing things that are outside the harmonic, the harmonies that are going on. So they don't actually have to leave the room or anything, you know. If you're playing over a 2-5-1, you might be playing inside the notes of the D minor chord, and when it comes to the G7 chord, you might play notes that are not the right notes, that don't really fit the chord properly. You'll be playing flat nines and sharp nines or whatever, or you might choose to play the whole tone scale or something else that has notes that are not the right notes. They're dissonant notes. They create a lot of tension. Sometimes they are the right notes. That's why I'm kind of like, oh, I don't really want to use that word, but they can be the right notes, and it's important to realize, of course, that if it sounds good, it is good. So it's more the moving outside is the creation of dissonance, so like sounds that are a bit angular and clashing, and it's that kind of the creation of tension and then releasing that tension that is a real kind of cornerstone thing in jazz. It's that mostly what jazz is about, is that creation of real tense sounds and harmonies, and then letting them resolve. I think it makes the resolved chords sound even more beautiful if they come from a real dissonant chord. So that's why you get all of these, you know, big extended chords. You have a G13 flat 9 chord going to a G6 9, and that 13 flat 9 sounds really, then relaxes. So that's moving outside. I just turn my page over because I, can't remember all of this stuff. Woodshedding. Again, you do get this term used in other styles of music, but particularly in jazz. Woodshedding is going to the woodshed to practice, often called shedding, and it just means literally sitting by yourself and practicing, transcribing, running lines, practicing your arpeggios, practicing your scales, practicing making changes, learning standards, all of that sort of stuff. You can't really do that much any other place except on your own in a little room. So, you can learn a lot from teachers, you can learn a lot from books, but most of your work in getting into kind of complex music like jazz is sitting by yourself and shedding, making sure that you practice that stuff up, because you don't want to be thinking too much in the real world when you're playing. You want to let it try and happen naturally as you can, but you've got to put the hours in to kind of, get that music in you, and get your fingers and your brain and your ears working in a way that they naturally hear those kind of sounds. So that's what shedding is, woodshedding. Okay, last couple of things. In jazz, you don't tend to have a jazz band. They tend to call them combos. I think probably back from the days in the 50s and 60s, one jazz musician would be in lots of different combos. And if you for me, a band is like your band of brothers. They're your close friends, and you're working together to make this music. Whereas in the jazz thing, you're either playing somebody else's music if you're doing standards, or you have a thing, the leader. So you might have John Coltrane as the leader of the band, and he'll have a combo behind him, which is the other musicians that he's working with playing his songs. But you might have exactly the same band with a different leader, so it's Miles Davis's quintet then or whatever, and Coltrane might be in the band. So and maybe the whole band could be the same, So in jazz, it tends to be called the combos, the combinations of musicians. And I should mention the word cat as well, because I found that very funny, particularly when I moved to London. All the jazz guys that I was hanging out with, all jazz musicians were referred to as cats instead of people or whatever, and I found that quite funny. But it's kind of cool. Miles Davis used to use it a lot, as well as used to call everyone cats, or MF. Was his other term that he used to use for musicians. But, you know, man, did you see that cat blowing some crazy sick-ass lines at Ronnie's, or whatever, this kind of, you know, funny terms that they'd come up with. But it was always cats. And so if you hear people talking about cats or jazz cats, they just mean people. It's just a funny term. There's not very many, like, furry felines that I've seen playing jazz. Maybe some. A train wreck. A train wreck is something that you don't want to be too involved with. Usually it happens when somebody gets lost in the song. So in jazz, because you've got you know, the chords are changing a lot. If you get a bit lost and you skip a bar or something, and you're trying to play the chord changes from memory instead of listening, which is not a good idea, but you know, it does happen, especially when you're starting out. You might be outlining the harmonies to a different part of the song than the rest of the band are playing, and that would be called a train wreck. I've been involved in a few, although you definitely want to try and avoid them if you can. Particularly if you're a beginner, the worst one to watch out for is in the song So What, where it's one chord for 16 bars, and then it moves up a semitone for 8 bars, and then back to the first chord for 8 bars. And in that song, very often people get lost and they don't know whether things are on the D minor or the E flat, and it's, if you get the wrong one, it can sound really funny. So yeah, watch out for train wrecks in that song. But they happen in all sorts of songs, particularly more complicated ones. Last couple of things, being in the pocket is a really important kind of term in jazz as well. It's all about the swing. Duke Ellington's got a song, It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, and finding that right kind of groove is a pretty important thing in jazz. It's one of the things that I struggle with, I'll be honest. You know, I'm kind of from a bluesy rock kind of a background, and particularly when I was starting playing jazz, I was definitely from a rock kind of a place, rock and blues, and I found it really hard to get a nice jazz feel, because it always sounded kind of rocky. And I think part of it's just listening to a lot of jazz. Definitely, if you want to get into playing jazz, you've got to listen to it a lot. That's really important, and something that I didn't do for too long. And yeah, I'll probably talk about that later again more, but it's really important that you listen to jazz, and by listening to it a lot, you'll kind of absorb that swing. So being in the pocket is like when things are grooving, you know, when everyone in the band has got the same amount of swing going on and things are moving as a unit really well. You'd say somebody's playing in the pocket. Generally, you want to be listening to the drummer. So the drummer will be playing a kind of a swing on the ride cymbal, like ting, 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 and you need to be kind of making sure that your rhythm is sitting nicely with that. You know, you don't want to try and change what the drummer's doing by changing how much swing you're putting on it. You need to be trying to catch his thing. Especially he's a drummer, he's a rhythm player, he should be hopefully giving you a good standard swing to follow to. So I think that's enough talking from me. My voice is getting tired. So hopefully that'll help you out with some of those terms that you might see as you're on your little jazz journey. And I'll see you for plenty more jazz lessons and loads of other stuff, of course, very soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.